Hello and welcome to this special edition of Middle East Matters here on France 24. Coming up on the programme, where to now for Israeli-Palestinian relations following spiralling violence that's exacerbating fears that the long simmering conflict could be on the verge of a broader escalation. Israeli forces killed 10 Palestinians in the Jenin refugee camp last Thursday in what was the deadliest raid in the West Bank for nearly 2 decades. While the synagogue attack that killed 7 people in East Jerusalem a day later was the worst seen in Israel since 2008. Well, tensions between Israelis and Palestinians were high even before last week's bloodshed and have been rising since a spate of Palestinian attacks that began last spring. Since then, dozens of Palestinians have been killed and more than 31 Israelis, but many fear that even worse is yet to come. Elected on promises that have added fuel to the fire, observers say the policies and the leaders of Israel's new far-right government are likely to further inflame tensions. In East Jerusalem, people are still coming to terms with the trauma of the attack that left 7 people dead as they'd gathered to pray at a synagogue last Friday. Brian Quinn has the details.
Just after 8 p.m. in the neighborhood of Neve Yaakov near Jerusalem, worshippers gathered in front of a synagogue for Friday prayers to mark the start of the Sabbath, when a Palestinian gunman opened fire on the crowd, killing 7.
We're facing an attack, one of the worst in recent years. A terrorist showed up and began shooting.
The gunman quickly fled in a car before being stopped by police and shot dead. That evening, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir visited the scene. The next day, bullet holes in the walls of nearby buildings bore witness to the violence of the attack.
You live in Jerusalem, you leave the house, and suddenly you're being shot. It's terrifying. It's just terrifying.
The horror would soon begin anew, as several kilometers away at 10:45 a.m., a 13-year-old Palestinian boy opened fire on passers-by, wounding several.
What happened 20 years ago, it started to happen right now. We need to think how we can advance and stop this situation.
Israeli security forces were put on maximum alert. Benjamin Netanyahu promising a strong and rapid response. Several hours later, the Prime Minister announced the blocking of access to Social Security for families of Palestinian attackers, along with a plan to revoke their Israeli identity cards. Authorities, meanwhile, were already sealing off the family home of the synagogue attacker.
The synagogue attack was followed by a second shooting on Saturday, which injured 2 Israelis. Both attacks seem to be an apparent retaliation to an Israeli raid on the Jenin refugee camp. Our correspondents have been meeting residents of the camp. From there, France 24's Iris Mackler sent this report.
Inside Jenin refugee camp, teenagers put up new posters of those recently killed. Intense clashes took place here last Thursday between the Israeli army and Palestinian militant groups. 10 Palestinians died, most of them gunmen. 20 more were injured.
Here was the first body, entirely charred. The second one was here, still burning. And the third one was there. We couldn't recognize the face, but we could see the body. On the second floor, there was also one wounded person.
Israel says it had intelligence that key members of the Islamic Jihad militant group were in this house and were planning imminent attacks against Israeli civilians. That's why they attacked the building with handheld rocket launchers. Now some of the walls are close to collapse. To be safe, the next day local authorities bring in a bulldozer to demolish the building. Many youngsters gather round to watch. About 100 metres away, the fighting could be seen from this window. Omar Obeid says his wife Majida was standing here when she was shot. She was 59 years old.
She was here on a chair when she heard gunshots. She tried to open the blinds to see what was happening, and then the army shot at her. Here's a bullet hole, here as well, and here.
They opened fire sporadically, as you can see, and one bullet hit the television. She was a woman at her window. She wasn't wearing a balaclava. She wasn't carrying an RPG.
In the family living room, women gather to offer condolences. The Israeli army says it will investigate whether any of those shot were unarmed civilians.
Well, to discuss the consequences of this latest escalation in violence, we can speak now with Gershon Baskin, director of the Holy Land Bond and columnist for the Jerusalem Post and Al-Quds newspapers. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme. Firstly, we heard in our earlier report people worried that what happened 20 years ago might be starting to happen again. Is further bloodshed inevitable? Some observers even fear another intifada.
There's a great deal of frustration on the Palestinian side. Secretary of State, U.S. Secretary of State Blinken, yesterday commented that the Palestinians have a very, very narrow horizon in front of them, and that's clearly true. There's frustration politically, there's frustration economically, and of course the security situation for both Israel and Palestine is not very good. The Palestinians don't seem to be in the spirit is perhaps not the right word, but in the organizational phase of putting together another intifada. The acts of violence that we've seen from Palestinians, acts of resistance, are normally taken by individuals and not organizations. The armed forces of the Palestinian security apparatuses are not participating. And Hamas has been rather quiet in Gaza, trying to activate the West Bank, not so much trying to set forth rockets from Gaza. So I'm not sure that we're at the beginning of a new intifada, but certainly if there is a further deterioration in the situation, it could launch another intifada.
And do you believe this uptick in violence bolsters the policies of the new government in Israel? Netanyahu, he may have been cautious in the past, but he's now in coalition with ultranationalists and settlers who are demanding more radical response.
Well, I think we are seeing more radical responses on the ground, not necessarily by the government, but there's a new spirit amongst the settlers, and there's a sharp increase in settler violence against innocent Palestinians, against towns and villages, shepherds in the Jordan Valley. We also see Mr. Ben-Gvir, our Minister of National Security, forcing the municipality of Jerusalem to demolish buildings that are slated for demolishment because they lack no license for building, which is the situation of a great deal of houses in East Jerusalem where Palestinians are unable to get licenses. We have all the formulations of the incitement on the Israeli side against the Palestinians, not only the Palestinians in the occupied territory, but the Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. And that does spark a sense of a need to respond, particularly amongst young, frustrated individuals who would resort to violence in response to these situations.
And those measures that we saw announced by the Israeli government last weekend, for example, the easing of gun licensing rules for civilians in Israel, and also punitive steps being taken against Palestinians, strengthening settlement, so-called, in the West Bank. What kind of an effect will all of those measures have, do you believe?
It's all part of this cycle that'll spring about a violent response, the increase of settlement building, the authorization of previously non-authorized settlements. There are about 100 non-authorized settlements. I want to be clear, all settlements are illegal according to international law, but there are settlements that Israeli government legally accepted and implemented and built, and other settlements that were done with a wink of an eye. They are unauthorized by the Israeli government, although they're all hooked up to the national infrastructure. The current government is now pushing to legalize all the unauthorized settlements. So that's certainly going to push Palestinians further to a sense of despair. The policies of the government are being felt strongly within the prisons of Palestinian political and security prisoners. There are more than 6,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli prisons for resistance activities against the Israeli regime and against Israelis. That includes settlers, that includes terrorists as well as combatants as well as non-combatants who are politically engaged. We have the previous government that shut down 6 Palestinian civil society organizations working on human rights issues, and this government will continue the trend, perhaps even closing down NGOs within the state of Israel, not only in the occupied territories.
And the Palestinian Authority as well, Gershon, last week it scaled back its coordination with Israel. Does that weaken, do you think, one of the means by which unrest had been contained in the past?
I think that on the ground, the Palestinian Authority security forces are still there to protect the Palestinian Authority mainly. They are unable to protect Palestinian civilians and citizens who can be attacked by Israel at any time that Israel wants. Israel goes into all areas of the occupied territories, whether they're under Palestinian Authority control or not. The Palestinian authorities said to Secretary Blinken that they would continue some form of security cooperation or coordination, but it's downscaled from what it was. I think that we can assume that the Palestinian Authority will continue to fight against Hamas and Islamic Jihad and other groups that might threaten the security of the Palestinian Authority, even if it's not in full coordination with Israel.
Finally, Gershon, you've said in the past that the disease that must be addressed, but that won't be, is the occupation, 55 years of Israeli military rule over Palestinians. Is there any hope for peace? It's a big question, but is there any cause for optimism?
I think there's not very much cause for optimism. I think that the current Israeli government will create a more robust international response. If we take France and the European Union, just as an example, the European Union is great at making declarations and statements about the need to end the occupation and to support the two-state solution. But France and many of the countries in the European Union who continue to repeat the mantra of two-state solution only recognize one of the states, and that's already for the past 25 years of the Oslo peace process. Isn't it time that countries like France, if they do believe in the two-state solution, which I'm not sure is viable anymore, but if they still believe in it, isn't it time that they recognize the state of Palestine as well?
Gershon Baskin, Director of the Holy Land Bond, thank you so much for your time with us on the programme. And that's
pleasure.
it for this special edition of Middle East Matters. Thanks for joining us. Stay with us for more world news here on France 24.
From North to South Africa, from Bamako to Nairobi, from Accra to Mogadishu. Bringing you all the political, economic, cultural and social news from Africa for a better insight into an ever-changing continent.
Across Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin-Smith on France 24 and France24.com.
France 24, your window on the world.
Liberté, égalité, actualité.